Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Managing Charity Property in Uncertain Times. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Rutherford and I am Head of the Charity and Social Enterprise Sector Group at Stone King. And we're delighted to be joining forces today with Buzzacott and Gerald Eve for today's event. Now, before we begin, some brief housekeeping. As webinar attendees, your computer cameras and microphones are all turned off. However, you will be able to communicate with us to ask questions at any point during the webinar using the Q&A function, which is available on the right-hand side of your screen. And it looks like two speech bubbles with a question mark in it. Now, if you type your question in there, it will be sent through directly to us. And if possible, we would ask that you don't ask your question anonymously, because if we're not able to get through all of the questions today, then we do hope to follow up with answers after the event, but that will be difficult to do if we don't know who asked the question. However, please note that any questions you ask won't be visible to the other attendees, so you don't need to worry about that. In addition, the webinar is being recorded, and after the event you will get sent a link that will enable you to play it again if you wanted to remind yourself of anything that was discussed. So on to the running order for today's event. So first of all, Paul Greenwood from Gerald Eve will be looking at an overview of current trends in the property market. He'll then be followed by Catherine Williams from Stone King, who will be taking you through some of the property and charity law issues that arise during lockdown. We'll then move to a section looking at financial issues with Paul back to talk about the role property plays in your finances, followed by Amanda Francis from Buzzacott identifying the financial and audit implications of the current changes in the property market. Then Luke Savas and Socrates from Buzzacott and Catherine will conclude with a look at the alternative ways you might consider using your property going forward, and in particular the issues that might raise from the perspective of trading. Then at the end, we'll open up to a panel discussion to go through any questions that we've received. So over to Paul to start us off.
Great, thank you, Tim. Morning all, my name's, as Tim's mentioned, is Paul Greenwood. I'm a partner in the alternative markets team at Gerald Eve. I, as part of a wider team, along with my colleagues Richard Moyer and Will Ray, who you may know, specialise in providing property advice to charities, and in particular to faith charities across most asset class sectors, with an emphasis on religious use properties. Having worked in the sector for some years, I'm aware of the challenges and pressures that charities ordinarily face as property owners, which I know from speaking to charity clients recently is currently being exacerbated by the lockdown measures in place and the uncertainties in the short and medium term, not only in terms of the day-to-day operational use of their properties, but also on the impacts on the potential value of their assets, any current or proposed property sales or developments to help further their missions and achieve their charitable objectives. I appreciate that it's a challenging time for us all, and we've found ourselves having to work from home without choice, having to manage and coordinate projects from a distance, while being forced to close properties providing services to communities at a time where its services are most at need. We're clearly facing a unique set of challenges, and yet we're seeing charities rapidly transform their approach to meet the needs of those who rely on them most. We're seeing charities stepping forward to do what they do best, to help communities, beneficiaries and supporters alike. As Tim's kindly mentioned, I'm going to talk you briefly through our findings on the current trends on the property sector, really with an emphasis in the alternative market, which I hope charities and faith groups listening in will find most relevant to their needs. Really on the first slide, which is our sort of overview of the current trends in the property market. We've probably heard this morning on the news the warnings from the Bank of England of the pandemic pushing potentially the UK economy towards the deepest recession on record, with the economy expected to shrink potentially by 14% this year based on the lockdown being relaxed in June. Oxford Economics and other forecasters are really expecting a sort of a U-shaped economic shock. Others have talked of a sort of a Nike tick or sort of other shaped sort of recovery positions, but the circumstances surrounding this looming downturn in the property market are really sort of very different to those that accompanied the 2008 financial crisis, as demand has slowed at the same pace as supply. From the real estate sector, I mean, sentiment towards the sector as a whole is really sort of emphatically among both investors and occupiers following the spread of the COVID, according to the RSS latest commercial property model. The government has really sort of introduced various measures to help the economy, including £300 billion worth of loans, business rates, holidays, and grants for retailers and pubs. There's also been a call for the Chancellor to cut rates on grants and stamp duty holidays. The greater threat in the property market is that the current paralysis will be followed by a broader economic downturn. A sharper and more prolonged deterioration in transactions and pricing brings with it the risk that property owners are going to be forced to write down their property values. Both investors and occupiers fear that we're not yet over the worst when it comes to the impacts on the real estate sector. And looking at several forward-looking metrics over the next 12 months for capital and both rental values suggest that values will potentially fall sharply across most property sectors in the short term. We're finding from all our generally sort of transactional side sort of based teams that transactions that were underway at the beginning of the year, some are proceeding largely without interruptions, others are really sort of being held in a holding pattern with terms agreed in principle, and also with some sort of having fallen through. But we expect generally that sort of Q2 and Q3 transactions, the volumes are likely to be very low. We are beginning to see signs of opportunistic investors and overseas capital keen to access assets, sensing an opportunity, but as yet we're really seeing limited distress on the sell side in the charity and faith group owned property sectors. We're finding that generally investors and developers are taking a much more risk averse approach until the length of the depth of the pandemic becomes clearer. We have seen, and you're probably all aware, that debt markets have seen a short contraction with most high street lenders retrenching and focusing on government loans as loan to value ratios have reduced and margins increased. We expect debt-backed buyers will struggle to hit their anticipated returns on new purchases really until pricing softens. Moving on to slide 2, where I'm going to touch generally on the sort of tone of the sort of retail and office markets. I appreciate that not all charities and faith groups own retail office properties, but I thought it'd be helpful just to give you a sort of feel and flavour as to the sort of tone of the conditions. That, I mean, generally the unprecedented closing of certain parts of the economy no doubt is going to have a huge impact on the retail and leisure sectors. And over the course of 2020, there's a prospect of occupiers, particularly retailers, entering into administration. And we're finding that some landlords, most in fact, are already receiving requests for rent reductions. And we expect to see demands for flexibility from tenants seeking to achieve rent holidays or relief for extending leases, or potentially sort of introducing inflation-linked rent reviews in order to maintain occupancy, which I gather Catherine from Stone King will discuss further on in further detail. Forced closures, of course, are impacting on landlords' ability to collect rent over the coming months, and many occupiers are struggling to meet quarter-day rent payments. We've heard from the press that Land Securities, one of the UK's biggest landlords, has reportedly only received 2/3 of the rent due last month from its tenants, and reported that 65% of rent due on the 25th of March was paid by the end of month, compared with 96% paid last year. Whilst retail and the leisure sectors appear to be the most depressed currently following the impact of lockdowns, the deterioration in sentiment appears to be most noticeable also in the office sector. And based on surveys carried out by the RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, that evidence suggests that the office sector may also be dramatically affected by the impact as employers move generally towards more agile, remote working environments, lowering the demand for office space. Turning briefly onto my next slide on the residential market, I think analysts are expecting a period of inactivity in the residential sector, although pricing so far seems to be holding up sort of relatively well. We are expecting, and most forecasts are expecting, that prices will soften the longer the inactivity continues. We're expecting, I suspect, a sharp contraction in sales during this initial period, and there will also be some needs-based and opportunistic buying, but I expect this will be in the minority. Transactions that are currently underway, we're hearing that some are still going ahead as planned and some have been paused and others sort of halted altogether. And I mean, clearly there is some uncertainty over the logistics of the moving process and the speed with which conveyancing can take place, which I know Catherine from Stone King will talk to you further through in further detail. In the lettings market, I mean, we feel that the sentiment is really remaining sort of relatively robust so far, but I think overall in the residential market, the underlying demand and supply dynamics in the market remain. Yet I expect there will be some unexpected and more long-lasting consequences of the pandemic. Looking and touching on again briefly the development market, I mean, clearly developers are becoming sort of more cautious in these uncertain times. We're finding developers are deferring land purchases until more clarity emerges, and however, there still appears to be a relatively strong appetite from the more entrepreneurial developers and potentially private-backed equity land buyers looking to acquire opportunistically. We're sensing that COVID-19 related restrictions have created short-term delays in property construction projects due to disruptions in supply chains and staff shortages. And we expect that developers could also face issues linked to financing and capital liquidity should delays in the construction periods become more protracted. We're finding that hearing from developers that most construction firms have had to extend in build periods, extend out, and also construction teams have been withdrawn from site to comply with social distancing measures. Whilst developers remain keen in principle to purchase new prime sites, some dates have been pushed back as much as 3 months in the absence of crisis-related discounts. Terms are generally proving more difficult to agree. Looking sort of more specifically to the community use market, and I'm really going to sort of touch on the sort of D1 market, which, as you probably all know, which covers different sort of group of organisations such as places of worship, schools, medical and health centres, and day nurseries, and sort of education facilities. I mean, from our experience generally, the market is highly price sensitive to issues both around risks such as planning, condition and refurbishment costs, with a significant impact on pricing. At the same time, we find that purchasers are generally more enthusiastic to secure properties in good locations rather than anywhere secondary. Planning policy will clearly strongly influence the demand for property. However, we expect that well-located properties will remain relatively resilient to any impact on pricing and demand. We are expecting, however, charities will be under, in short term, sort of process, increasing pressure to strategically review their estates to assess how they can optimise the use of their space and consolidate assets where possible, and may look to dispose of assets to release capital if necessary, which I'll discuss further on later in our discussion. Well, I hope that gives you a brief update on the property market. I appreciate I've covered sort of a fairly sort of wide sort of sector base. I'll now hand you back over to Catherine Williams of Stone King, who will provide you with an update on property law and advice on managing leases. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Paul. So as Paul says, I'm going to run through the current change in the law, the landlord and tenant relationship, and then update you on the guidance on buying and selling property. So if we look at the first slide, we've got a new law in place called the Coronavirus Act 2020. That covers a whole host of matters, but on the property side, it includes provisions which limit a landlord's ability to terminate existing leases. And the rationale for that is that the government doesn't want individuals or businesses being made homeless during the lockdown. So for commercial tenancies, a landlord would normally have the right to forfeit a lease, which basically means to re-enter and take that property if the tenant fails to pay rent. The Act stops the landlord from doing that now until the 30th of June 2020. And on the residential side, a landlord now needs to give 3 months notice for to start possession proceedings, and any possession proceedings that were in the system already have been suspended for 90 days. So those are sort of the key dates and timeframes that we've got at the moment, although the government has got the ability to change those depending on how the lockdown progresses. Now, apart from these terms above, the rest of the terms of your leases will remain the same. So the tenant is still obliged to pay rent and is still obliged to comply with the rest of the terms of the lease. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to explore a bit further the landlord and tenant arrangement, as that seems to be the area that's causing the most problems and raising the most amount of legal queries. And I appreciate that because everything has sort of progressed so quickly, that it is worthwhile just taking stock and reviewing the arrangements between the parties. So if you're a landlord and you've got a tenant that's struggling to pay rent, then have a look to see if you've got a rent deposit you might be able to call on, or a guarantee. And equally, if you're a tenant and you're now sort of looking at your property and wondering whether you need it all, then you want to be having a look at the lease to see if you've got any break clause coming up, whether you could assign the lease, that basically means sell it to somebody else, or if you could be underletting or sharing it with somebody. The government has kind of accepted that this is a bit of a problem area and has issued guidance saying it expects landlords and tenants to have frank and open conversations and to agree a sensible way forward. So what I'd like to do now, if we go on to the next slide, is have a look at the rent position in particular, as that's where we're getting queries from tenants who are struggling and they want to engage with their landlords, and equally with landlords who've either received requests or are expecting requests and want to know what their options are. So on the slide, I've put up a sort of sliding scale of options for dealing with your rent, and I'm just going to run through each of them and give you a few examples. So number one is a rent holiday or rent suspension. The parties may agree that for a specific period of time, the rent won't be payable at all. Obviously, that's the best position for a tenant, but probably the least attractive for a landlord. So another option, option two, would be to agree a rent reduction, which is where the parties agree for, again, a specific period of time that the rent will either be reduced by a specific amount or by a specific percentage. I should just flag it here, as charity landlords, I think we need to be a bit careful when it comes to options 1 and 2, and I'll come on to explain that a bit further in a moment. Option 3 is a rent deferral, so the parties may agree that rent won't be paid for a specific period of time, but after that period has passed, the rent is payable as normal and any unpaid rent is recouped. So a practical example might be if I'm a tenant and I pay my rent monthly, I might agree with my landlord that I won't pay rent for May and June, but then come July, I'll pay my normal payment of rent and then I'll pay back my unpaid May and June rent over a period of time. That could be in one lump sum, but more usually that would be sort of in staggered payments. Now, from the tenant perspective, that gives you a bit of a respite, but it does mean that the full rent is still payable, albeit at a later date. From the landlord perspective, you are foregoing rent, so that could obviously impact on your cash flow, but hopefully you then get the full payment of rent just a bit later on. I guess as a landlord, you just need to be a bit careful that you are taking the risk that the tenant will be able to pay it all back in the future. Option 4 can be a really useful thing, is just to change the rent payment dates to ease cash flow. So if a tenant typically pays rent on a quarterly basis, moving to monthly rent payments might be quite helpful. Option 5, you can do nothing. So as I mentioned, the Coronavirus Act doesn't impact on the tenant's ability to pay rent. So as a landlord, you could just say, this is what the lease says, this is the rent that's payable, and I'm expecting that. Obviously, I think you just need to be a bit careful that you don't, as a landlord, that you aren't sort of pushing your tenant too far. You don't want to end up in a situation potentially where the tenant goes under and then you're left with a terminated lease and an empty property which you've got to try and re-let. You've also got to be mindful as a landlord, you can't actually enforce it at the moment because of that sort of moratorium. So your usual threat of if you don't pay the rent, I'm going to terminate the lease doesn't apply at the moment. Equally, the tenant, if you decide to do nothing and not pay your rent, then you run the risk that once these moratorium periods are lifted, the landlord will come after you to terminate the arrangement. And then option 6 might be a combination of the above. So you might, for example, agree to defer the rent for a couple of months and then move on to monthly payments, or you might agree to reduce the rent, but in exchange for that, move to a monthly payment period. Obviously, there's no hard and fast rule, and it totally depends on your specific situation with your tenant, or if you're a landlord, and your property. Obviously, rent is just one element of the sums payable under the lease. So there might be other payments like a service charge if you've got communal areas where everyone contributes towards maintenance of those bits, or insurance rent where a tenant contributes towards the insurance of the property. Generally, I would try and advise that we kind of steer clear of changing those payments. And so generally, if you need to give your tenant any flexibility, that you do that around the area of rent and that you try and leave service charge as it is, just because it can get a bit messy. And also with insurance rent, that's a cost that the landlord's still going to have to pay for insuring the property. So you'd ideally want your tenant to keep contributing towards that. Now, as charities, as you're all aware, you have got an extra layer of regulation, and your overarching duty is to act in the best interest of your charity. And that would include any dealings relating with your tenants relating to their rent. And I do think as charity landlords, you probably just need to be a little bit careful about being seen to gift money to tenants by automatically agreeing a rent holiday or a rent suspension. So where possible, you should try and look to see if you can get an agreement that deals in the region of options 3 to 6. Obviously, I appreciate there may be situations where option 1 and 2 are the most appropriate. So that's a rent holiday or suspension or a rent reduction. If you are going to go down this route, then you do need to check your constitution or governing document to make sure that you have the power to compromise or settle claims. And if the charity does have that power, then it can be used to settle any claim that the charity has against the tenant. The claim in this situation being a claim against the tenant for full payment of the rent, as set out in the lease. So if you have that power to settle or compromise, then you may be able to use that power to reduce or suspend the rent. But my key point to get across here is that in agreeing any sort of rent reduction or rent holiday is that you must be able to show that this is in the best interest of the charity and that you have taken into account all the relevant factors. So relevant factors would be things like the cost that the charity would incur of pursuing the tenant for full payment of the rent. If you can demonstrate that would be completely disproportionate. If you're satisfied, hopefully the tenant's given you evidence that they cannot pay the rent in full and their position has drastically changed. Another relevant factor might be the long-term implications. So if you don't work with your tenant, so if you push your tenant so hard by pursuing the full rent, and that means that they go under and then you're left with an empty property, which you might have to pay rates on and which you're then going to try and re-let in an uncertain market. So what I'm saying is you can go for options 1 or 2, but I think you just need to be a bit careful, and it wouldn't be my first way of dealing with the tenant. And obviously, because you're accountable to your beneficiaries and to the public at large, you need to make sure that you have a full audit trail setting out your decisions, why you think it's in the best interest of the charity and the factors that you've taken into account. So that's all I was going to say on rent and sort of the landlord and tenant relationship. If we could move to the next slide, I did just want to give you an update on the government's current guidance on buying and selling property. So broadly, the guidance is split into whether the property that you're looking to buy or sell is either vacant or occupied. So if it's a vacant property, then the guidance is that you're okay to move, provided that you can comply with social distancing regulations. And probably, as Paul's already alluded to, you can actually find someone to move you, because that's been a real problem in getting removal vans, etc. If your property is occupied, so you're in a chain of sales and purchases, then the advice is that you really should try and delay completion, just because the risks of interacting with other people, moving into a property, etc., are just a lot higher. So that's if you've exchanged. If you're looking to exchange contracts, then it's a bit difficult at the moment, because ideally, obviously, when you exchange contracts, you need to set a completion date, and we don't really know how long this is going to go on for. But I would be saying that a completion date sometime in the summer is probably advisable. But what you absolutely must have is provisions in your contract to allow for completion to be moved. So if, for example, you get to your completion date and someone's been taken ill or someone's exhibiting symptoms and they need to self-isolate, that there's a provision that allows your completion date to be moved either by 14, 21 days, whatever. And generally I've found that where we are still looking to progress transactions, that parties will agree to those types of provisions. So that's everything I wanted to say on the legal position. I'm now going to hand you back to Paul, who has some advice on what you can be doing during the lockdown.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And I mean, clearly there's clearly a sort of limit as to what could be done in terms of sort of moving and really sort of preparing for a sale. But I mean, using this time, we think could be vital. I mean, recent events have shown us that change can be thrust on us very quickly, and we all really need to be quite resilient and quick to embrace change. I mean, this time it can be put to good use, and we're seeing a number of charities taking advantage of the time to review their estate strategies, really to ensure that they're making the most efficient and cost-effective use of their properties to meet the needs and goals of the charity's objectives. Preparing an up-to-date strategic estate plan will help you to make decisions supported by evidence. It will also sort of help with your resources, using your resources most efficiently, and could also potentially maximise the estate's value. Clearly, there's a number of factors which will influence your plan, which may include the information you hold about the estate, the land you hold, your basis of occupation and tenure, and also any physical constraints, as well as your charity's needs and your capacity to support your charity's objectives. How you manage the estate will obviously vary depending on how you're governed and financed, and may include legislative or planning issues which may need addressing, along with your availability of space and land. The virus is likely to be a feature of life for years to come, will no doubt impact on both how students, community groups and stakeholders interact, and is likely to affect how public areas and communal space are used. Therefore, I think taking this time and planning ahead could allow for you to help future-proof your estate. As part of any sort of sensible sort of asset management plan, trustees may find that they need to consider consolidating assets, which I've touched on before, potentially sort of optimise the use of their estates by identifying surplus assets to dispose of to release capital, particularly to help fund projects or missions to meet the needs of their charity's objectives. Where there are potentially opportunities to maximise rental income achievable or to improve lease terms, such as lease regearing or extending lease terms, or maybe exchanging rent-free periods in return for break options being removed, anticipating a future slowdown, which I think is inevitable in the lettings market post-COVID-19, could and will protect your cash flow and should potentially be considered against voids. Where there are really sort of no clear reasons to support the sale of properties to release capital, borrowing against assets may be an option, and has been recommended by the Charities Commission in a recent guidance note published on the 23rd of April titled Managing Financial Difficulties in Your Charity Caused by Coronavirus, which I expect Catherine will touch on. In deciding how best to proceed with any property transaction, clearly your starting point is always what is in the best interest of your charity, and you'll also be required to seek sort of preliminary advice from both a solicitor and also a qualified surveyor to set out how best to proceed in accordance with the requirements with the Charities Act. If the decision is made to sell assets at this time, there is clearly a risk that you may raise for less capital than you would in normal times, and I think this may be in the interest of the charity to meet urgent needs or in helping the charity to survive, but the guidance note does state that you should have clear reasons to support the decision, and you should check that they're in line with your charity's purpose and governing document. When the decision is, and moving on to my next slide, just really talking briefly about preparing a property for sale. Again, we're slightly restricted at the moment in the lockdown provisions that as what can be done, but there are a number of things that could be done, such as collating and pulling together title documentation, leases, or any sort of license agreements that are in place, and maybe considering addressing title irregularities such as boundary issues or adverse possession or sort of right-of-way issues, and also considering with the help of your solicitors any restrictive covenants and any advice that may be needed from solicitors and the like and surveyors on the impacts of releasing the restrictions or and any sort of enhanced value that may achieve, and clearly considering taking this time to review any planning potential to enhance value through planning permission for alternative use, whether that be for sort of residential or for a change of use or for development. And in terms of the sort of practicalities of any sale, commissioning the likes of energy performance certificates, which are a requirement we're probably all familiar with. I appreciate that access is difficult at the moment, but where access can be allowed for vacant properties and EPCs can be conducted, then that may be something worthwhile carrying out. And clearly, as I touched on before, appointing and engaging with solicitors and taking that sort of upfront preliminary advice from both qualified surveyors and taking advice on value and marketing approach, etc., in accordance with the requirements of the Charities Act is clearly that something can be done now in readiness to sort of prepare any properties that are in mind to be disposed of in the short term and the sort of medium term. And anyway, well, I hope that's provided a few helpful prompts and sort of reminders. I'm sure you're probably aware of most of these things and probably on top of them all, but I'll pass you now on to Amanda Francis of Buzzacott, who will provide you with an update on the financial and audit implications. So over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everybody. COVID-19, of course, has had an enormous impact on everybody's lives, and it's very understandable that the impact on finances is probably not something that has been at the forefront of your mind. You're very much people organisations, and therefore you would have been thinking about your members, your beneficiaries, and the people that work for you. But financial implications do arise as a result of virtually everything. So we do need to think about what the financial result is of COVID-19. And for some of you, that may be quite significant, particularly if you still operate schools or you have care homes or homes for your own members. Many of you will be increasingly reliant on things like your investment income, and that from your listed investments. The investments themselves will be quite volatile. Their capital value will go up and down over the next few months and years, but so too will there be an impact on your investment income. And we're anticipating that income from listed investments will probably fall by 25 to 35%. We've also heard that we're expecting to go into a recession, and that will inevitably increase certain elements of your expenditure as shortages continue. So there is a need to think about the impact of COVID-19 on your finances, not just for the current year, but I would suggest for 2021 as well, and probably further ahead. I would urge you not to cut back on some of the essentials such as food, cost of care, heating and so on, but to instead look to some of your other assets. And the key one of those would be your property. For many of you, property is a significant asset, and therefore there are implications for your income and your expenditure, and possibly planning opportunities as well in terms of finances. So I'm going to look at two areas, the big picture and then some of the detailed questions. And I am going to be asking questions, I'm afraid, or questions that I think you should be asking. I don't have many of the answers because the answers will be specific to you. In terms of the big picture questions, I think the first thing to think about and reflect on is how important is income from your properties in respect to your finances. Do you rely on rental income from tenants, or were you anticipating significant receipts from the disposal of property in the next year or the next few years? If you have surplus space and at the moment you are not utilising that, one of the things you might be asking is there an opportunity there for us to let it out, to invite tenants in and so on. Similarly, I think you need to look at the other side of the equation and ask what proportion of our expenditure relates to property. As I said, there are certain property expenses such as heating that I would urge you not to cut back on. But there may be others, such as repairs and maintenance, that you can reschedule and defer to a later period. I'm going to look on both of those in slightly more detail in a moment. But I think as we're all sitting at home in lockdown, one of the things that we probably are all thinking about is doing those things that we've put off for so long. And there are opportunities here to look at some of the things that you've probably not been paying as much attention to as perhaps you should have done in respect to property. So I would urge you, as Paul has already hinted, to look at whether you should be talking to your solicitors and registering those properties that at the moment are not registered with the land registry, whether you should be investigating whether some of your properties have restricted covenants in respect to them and whether you can get those released. And again, resolving things like boundary issues so that there's clarity going forward, so that at the point when the markets do recover and you have the opportunity to sell property, you're ready to go immediately. Similarly, you may already have tenants in rented property and looking at the leases and tenancy agreements that you have with them, making sure they're as tidy as they should be, that they're watertight and so on. But also taking this opportunity to think about your longer term property strategy. Going forward over the next decade, property is going to be a key financial asset for many of you. And it's thinking about which properties are we likely to be have available to us to dispose of, when are we going to dispose of them, are we ready, what sort of proceeds are we going to receive, and so on. And similarly, in terms of timing, just thinking about the properties that you're going to retain, rather than spending a lot of money every 5 years on all of your properties, spacing that expenditure out, so devising a property strategy, a maintenance strategy, so that you know what work you're going to do on which properties when you're going to do it, and so that it's evenly spread over the next few years. In terms of the detailed questions that you're going to need to ask, so going on to the next slide. From the income side, I think you do need to be looking at that property strategy and asking yourselves, can we afford to defer property sales? As Paul has suggested, the property market is going to be quite difficult for the next few years. But if you need cash, it may be more sensible still to get that from property disposals rather than disposing of listed investments. So think about the timing of property sales, think about the location and whether actually the COVID-19 issues are going to affect the property valuation significantly. But also use the time to plan, to prepare for going to market, to prepare all of those things such as land registry and removal of covenants and so on, so that when the markets do improve, you are ready to go immediately. Alternatively, if you decide not to dispose of a property now, but it's empty, one of the things that you might consider is renting it out. And as Catherine has suggested, this is not something that's a simple decision. You do need to think through the implications very seriously. You need to be thinking about how long is the property going to be vacant for, and what sort of rental income can we receive from it? What type of tenant do we want in this property? Are we looking at a family, or are we looking at a commercial tenant, or are we looking at renting out to another charity? For example, a charity that might then manage the property for you and use it to house key workers, the homeless, victims of domestic violence, and so on. You also need to think about whether you're going to how you're going to deal with repairs that are needed to the property, who's going to be responsible, yourself or the tenant, and obviously there are financial implications there. And you also need to think seriously, I think, about whether you want to be a landlord. It sounds simple, it isn't. It's one of those things that within 6 months of being a landlord, you'll probably be asking, why did we ever do this? So think about whether you want to be the landlord, or whether you want to have an arrangement where you ask an agent to actually manage the property on your behalf and deal with the hassle of repairs, how you deal with damage created by the tenant, how you collect rent, and so on. All of those things mean that you should be taking advice if you're thinking about using your excess space to rent out. Taking advice from people like your lawyers, from your property advisors, but also I would suggest from people who've done this before. It's always worth learning from the mistakes that others have made so that you don't make them. So talk to somebody else who may have rented out surplus space and what advice they have for you. As Catherine has suggested, if you are already renting out space and you have tenants, you probably experience them coming to you and asking for a rental holiday or to defer their rent. And as she has suggested, it's again something you need to think about. So don't answer immediately, give it some thought, take some advice, think about whether you can grant a rental holiday or waive rent in its entirety. Think about how affordable it is to you to grant that, not just to the tenant. And think about whether the tenant really does need a rental holiday, or if they're asking you to waive rent, it may be worth going back to them and saying, well, you're not prepared to do that, but you are prepared to defer rent, and so on. Think also about, if you grant some waiver of rent, how long you're going to permit that to go on for before you have a financial issue yourselves. So think about all of the financial questions you should be asking in that regard. If you do have properties that you don't use yourselves, but that you're not renting out, then obviously they're going to be empty, and that's probably going to mean that they are becoming expensive. Empty property often needs some form of security. It will need insuring, so you'll need to talk to your insurance brokers, and there may be an issue with rates. You may at some point be required to pay rent, and the 80% relief that you get for charitable use may disappear. The other aspects in terms of expenditure, as I've said earlier, are there big maintenance projects that you can defer? Is that sensible? If you do defer them, are you at risk of creating health and safety issues in respect to that property? Do you create a bigger problem if you leave it because the problem gets worse and therefore will be more expensive to deal with in a few months' time? But I do think it's worth thinking about whether you can reschedule some of your maintenance and therefore defer some of the expenditure over the next few months at least, to provide you with that little bit of flexibility in terms of your cash flow. It's also worth, just as I said earlier, thinking about a longer term maintenance schedule and programme. And some of you may well be in the middle of very significant building projects. I'm aware of at least one client that moved out of their premises at the beginning of the year so that their existing premises could be refurbished and extended. So you need to think about, if you're in that situation, just looking at the contractual terms that you have with your construction company. They may well have halted work. That may delay the project quite significantly. What does that mean in terms of you? If you're in alternative accommodation, will you need to be talking to perhaps your landlords to extend the tenancies that you may have taken out? There may be some penalty clauses within the construction project contract, which you need to be looking at to make sure that the contract doesn't become overly onerous. So a lot of questions there. Questions that you're likely to be asked when we come to audit. And my final slide is just touching on a few of the audit implications. One of the things that your auditors will have expected you to have given some serious thought to is the financial impact of COVID-19 on yourselves. And they will be asking you for you to present to them budgets and cash flows. They don't need to be hugely sophisticated, but they do need to demonstrate that you've thought through this. And that means thinking about the assumptions that you've made in terms of how long COVID-19 will last, what impact it will have on your investment returns over the next year or so, whether there will be implications for your rental income, for other income in terms of schools and homes that you may have. So note down the assumptions, what you thought about, and how you have then determined the arithmetic, what the maths actually shows the impact is going to be on your income and your expenditure. And as I said, I think you should be doing this not just for 2020, but for 2021 also. And as a result of that arithmetic exercise, you will come up with a situation that probably needs you to take some mitigating actions. So what are those? Are they deferral of expenditure on repairs? Are they giving your tenants rental holidays and so on? And as Catherine said, the important thing with regard to that is an audit trail, so that you've got a record of the decisions you've taken. All of this will to some extent need to be discussed in your trustees report. So within your trustees report, you'll need to give or deal with a section headed up COVID-19. And within that, talk about the impact that the virus has had on your way of life, on the way that you work, the fact that you're locked down, whether you're spending a lot more time on the telephone talking to beneficiaries rather than providing pastoral visiting and so on, the impact on your properties and the impact on your people. And then you'll also, within the trustees report, need to summarise what those budgets and cash flows actually show in terms of the effect on your income and expenditure flows, and describe the actions that you've taken to mitigate any negative impact that it may have on your finances. And then finally, of course, your accounts may mean that your auditors are thinking quite hard about whether they are able to put a clean audit report on your accounts. Most of you will not be in the position where you're looking at any form of qualification, but you may find that your auditors are talking to you about a modification of the audit report. And what that really means is something that we call an emphasis of matter. And that's really a signposting within the auditor's report to the reader of those accounts to actually say, these accounts do show a true and fair view, but really we do suggest that you look at pages X and Y in the trustees report and the accounts, where it explains the impact on this organisation of COVID-19 and gives more detail. So you may find that your auditors are talking about that signposting within their report. As I said, very few of you will be looking at any form of audit qualification. The only possibility I think there is where you have a lot of property which you rent out and you use for investment purposes, and then your auditors may be slightly nervous about the valuation applied to that property and may start to consider whether there is something more that needs to be said in the audit report. I think to sum up in terms of audit implications, the key thing I would urge you all to do is to talk to your auditors. We're all learning how to audit remotely, which is probably not to be recommended. But the important thing is that we continue to talk with one another in the wake of COVID-19 and understand the impact it will have on the practicalities of doing an audit, but also on your finances. Now I'm going to hand back to Paul, who's going to talk about the future property market and the outlook for it. Paul.
Great, thank you, Amanda. I mean, clearly at this stage, it's really too early to predict the likely lasting impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the property market. But I mean, what started really as a public health crisis has probably morphed more into an economic one, and we expect to see further structural long-term change as a result of the pandemic. We expect generally there'll be a flight to quality in the property market as investors move their capital away from riskier assets to safer assets in an effort to preserve their income. I think we're going to find that covenant strength and rental security are likely to play a key part as greater emphasis is placed on tenants' ability to pay their rent. And I think over the medium and long term, we anticipate continued strong investor demand as the fundamentals in the property sector remain relatively robust in the face of change due to its compelling demand and supply dynamics. I think prime assets are likely to be more resilient in the current environment. And in the short term, riskier, more secondary assets such as church halls, schools and some care homes with void potential and requiring capital expenditure commitments will potentially attract more bearish assumptions, which will negatively impact on pricing. I think we expect that those secondary assets, which may have been carried with the rising market in recent years, may suffer in the short term, with investors and developers now being slightly more discerning, and we expect the buyer pool for riskier assets, more secondary assets, to shrink over the short term unless prices fall significantly. We've already seen the impact on the retail sector and consumer behaviours, which I think are initially being sort of impacted first, and there's clearly a changing need for necessity, and how the office sector is being affected by more agile working, remote working, co-sharing, and we expect that charities and faith groups will soon need to adapt and change the way in which they operate from their asset class. In terms of sort of future opportunities, I think we're going to find in the short term we expect to see opportunistic investors and developers keen to acquire assets, sensing an opportunity. But as yet, we're seeing really limited distress on the sell side in the charity and faith group owned property sectors. I think there could be opportunities for religious orders or charities who operate trading assets such as care homes and schools, who have an operational need or an identifiable demand to merge or acquire assets from other operators who are trading at a deficit at marginally reduced levels. I think measures to sort of mitigate loss of revenue through implementing potentially sort of sale and leasebacks of schools or care homes and community use properties may also be an area that charities and faith groups may wish to consider, where long leases could be granted to good covenants, and as demand from investors and property funds for secure long-term income continues to increase. I think charities and religious orders may also consider the current downturn in the market as an opportunity to dispose of assets in prime locations, essentially to fund acquisitions of more cost-effective solutions for expansion in more fringe peripheral locations where prices are currently softening at a faster rate than the more prime locations. And as Amanda touched on earlier, I think implementing co-sharing strategies where charities have surplus space that potentially could be sublet to other charities or other commercial organisations to offset the cost of space in some cases sharing resources and amenities could be an option for charities to consider. But clearly this comes with its own implications from a tax perspective, which Luke Sellers from Buzzacott will be able to pick up on. I'll now hand you over to Luke, who I guess is going to talk through and provide advice on trading subsidiaries for alternative uses of property. Over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everybody. I think before I sort of go into the section on trading subsidiaries, I just like to say that obviously there's a lot of pressure from your tenants, as we've heard from the previous speakers, to do something on rent, etc., and the good advice that you had earlier. And as Catherine mentioned, there's certain things that you want to sort of refrain from doing as far as your tenants are concerned. One thing that isn't quite to do with my slides, but I thought was worth mentioning, is that from the other side of things is that we get businesses that approach us, and there are quite a lot of schemes out there. Some are accessible to certain businesses and some, sadly, are very far away. So some of the hospitality sectors, there's lots of grants that are available at the moment, and sadly some are feeling it's better for them cash flow wise to actually stop trading and furlough all of their staff rather than have these what they call dark kitchens and provide maybe takeaway services, etc. But do bear in mind that although some will be trying to save on their rent, they are being helped, many are, by other means, and just bear that in mind. And there are those government supports at the moment, and that's the key, because I do feel that some of those may tail off a little bit and you may be seeing more pressure from tenants in the future. So sorry to sidetrack slightly, but I think that's important to mention because it leads me on to say, well, actually, what does happen if you have an empty property? Should you be thinking about what you can be doing with that property? As Amanda touched on and mentioned, that empty property will be sitting there and actually costing you money. So you may be looking to get other tenants in, not a great market, however flexible you're going to be to try and get new tenants in to be operating in this current market if it's commercial. So you may say, well, actually, we've got this empty property. Can we use it ourselves? Can we generate some income and provide services? And it may not be income driven. It may be just trying to add something back to the community, providing a service, whether it be, well, excuse my picture, providing coffee for maybe takeaway services, or bearing in mind what will the ongoing social distancing rules will be as to whether people can sit and actually chat. But you may want to provide that sort of support and also generate income at the same time. Now, as religious charities, your objects generally are very wide, so you can provide these services and not necessarily think about having to put them into a separate commercial trading subsidiary. So it's important, before you do think about sort of various ideas and things that you want to do, is to look back at your objects, because what you may be thinking of doing, whether it's a coffee shop, whether it's providing some care services or something extra, support for the NHS or whatever it is in some of that surplus property, it may fall within your objects and is what we call primary purpose trading, which is exempt from tax. So that's good news, and you would therefore not need to consider using a trading subsidiary to operate that activity. It won't necessarily be for tax purposes that you may think about that, so I'll go on to that in a moment. The other thing that is often overlooked is that there is an exemption from corporation tax, is if a trade is carried out wholly or mainly by the beneficiaries of the charity. So that could be members of if it's a religious organisation, or basically members of the public that you're there to help and serve, who will be beneficiaries according to your charitable objects. So it could be trying to get people back into work and providing the coffee shop and learning how to make coffee, etc. Any profit or an income from that activity for corporation tax is exempt because it's being carried out by the beneficiaries. So we have quite a lot of things to think about and sort of steps before we think about investing in setting up a trading subsidiary, which will inevitably lead to more administration and costs along with that as well, which I'll touch on in a moment. Now, we talked about surplus property, maybe bringing in other tenants, etc. And if you're just renting the property out, maybe under sort of a more amenable rental agreement to try and attract a tenant under current circumstances. If it's pure rent that you're providing on a tenant landlord type arrangement, then that's exempt. Rental income is exempt. What gets confusing is where actually you are letting out facilities or hiring out your facilities or providing service facilities. Now, in the current market, I can imagine that there will be a sort of a short-term need, so not necessarily to go into a sort of a cumbersome lease agreement to actually provide space, but somebody may say, a bit like the sort of serviced office arrangements, that we'd like to use some space in the short term to provide a service. Can we pay a sort of a rent for that? You'll provide the sort of amenities, whether it's sort of cleaning and it's sort of furniture, computers, whatever it is, and even catering. Now that's a complete service, and that isn't rental activity. That's actually trading activity, and could be taxable unless that type of activity falls within your objects, as I mentioned earlier. So if you have got taxable activity, well, then you'll be thinking about potentially using a trading subsidiary to put that activity in there and protect the actual charity itself, because it's not necessarily for tax purposes, and actually it's better to do it for other reasons and commercial reasons, that you avoid having risk in the charity and risking the other assets by actually using that property to be licensed onto your subsidiary to then carry out that activity. So if you're unfortunate that it doesn't actually quite work out, then you are protecting, as under a separate legal limited liability entity, you are protected, you're protecting the main charity and its assets. So that's a good reason other than tax. But if you are thinking about tax, then we've mentioned some exemptions already. And the other exemption that a lot of people can rely on is what we call the small scale trading exemption. So if you don't think that the activity will actually generate a lot of income, it's reasonable to expect that the income will not, for most of you, go over £80,000 in your financial year, then you will not have to worry about tax, and you can carry on that activity in the charity. And that's sort of like a first year test, because even if you go over the 80,000, then as long as it was reasonable to expect on sort of day one of your financial period that you wouldn't go over, then you're exempt. So I think in the certainly in the current climate, I think it's not reasonable to expect you to do well from necessarily these ideas of sort of commercial trading. So in most cases, you maybe sort of really quite happy with putting off setting up a trading subsidiary, but it'd be a thought for the future. So let's say the activity, well, the other thing you have to bear in mind is your other trading activity, because it's not just that activity that you have to think about, because you could have lots of small trades that will take you over the 80,000. If you're worried about that, then the subsidiary may be the way to go now. So if we move on to the next slide. There we go. Just a small diagram of how it works with a trading subsidiary for those that aren't aware is generally the trading subsidiary is 100% owned by the charity, the organisation. Now this proves useful because it's endorsed by HMRC, so much so that they allow you an extra 9 months in which to donate your profits up to the charity. So it gives you time to work out what your taxable profit is going to be, what your accounts are going to look like for that period. Now, that's important, I'll touch on in a minute, because how that works is that your trading subsidiary is a normal company subject to corporation tax and its profits. But if it donates its profits up to your charity, or it could be actually any charity, people forget that, then it reduces its profits to nil and pays no tax. So that 9-month extension, which you'll see on the side there, and it applies to your period end, because you may have a short period, which is important to note, may not just be a year for your new trading subsidiary, that 9-month extension would apply to any payments to any charity. Now, a lot of questions I've had recently revolve around not actually necessarily making money for themselves, but actually supporting the NHS and other things and the community in general. So you may actually be doing something for one of the NHS charities, and that doesn't stop it from being trading. So you can't just carry that on in your charity because you're supporting the NHS and donating profits to them. You would still use this sort of structure, but you could donate it to an NHS charity and still enjoy the 9-month extension to make that gift aid payment. You'll see from the down arrow that there are other things you need to consider. That you're providing the land, so there'll have to be a license, and you'll speak to someone like Catherine as to set that up, because you have to have that formalised between the charity and your subsidiary, and also the other support services. So if I move on to the next slide, if I've listed here, there we go, slide there, that initial funding is important as well, because the subsidiary will need some money to actually get going what it's doing, whether it's setting up a coffee shop, buying into coffee equipment, etc. Now, often that's done by minimal amount of share capital, and any money that's needed is lent over to. Now we're seeing a sort of trend to go to share capital, because share capital can be a little bit more it's a little bit more adaptable now, given issues we have with reserves, which I will touch on, but I won't go into great detail. But reserves are a thing that you need to bear in mind. But you may consider either share capital or loan, or a mixture of both, to fund your subsidiary company. The other thing that Catherine will touch on in a moment is things like you'll have to have formal license agreements in place, and potentially a deed of covenant, which allows you to make the payment under law, or you must make under law generally, to the charity. And by having a deed of covenant, it allows you to make a provision in your accounts for that donation. So I mentioned the gift aid and reserves issue. Now, what we're seeing in the current climate is quite a few issues. Is that you may make, let's say, for example, in your first period, £100,000 worth of profits, lovely, and you'll need to donate that up in order to actually shed that taxable profit. So you've got those 9 months. So you may wait, and in 9 months' time, you look at your profits, and actually it could be in the current climate you've made some losses. So you may have an existing trading subsidiary which in the last few months has turned into a loss. Now that will hit your reserves, and as the donation, whether it's under deed of covenant or not, but under gift aid, is a distribution. It's a distribution under company law, which means, sorry, the boring stuff, is that you have to have sufficient distributable reserves, normally profits, in your subsidiary, which is not the same as tax profits. So you need to take into account at the time that you make or decide to make that distribution up, that you've got enough reserves. And the current fluctuation and issues at the moment may mean that you might have a loss that impacts that. So sorry, that was a little bit long-winded and not necessarily so clear, but please do speak to me if you're worried about your reserves issues in your current trading subsidiaries. That's more of an issue for those that have already been set up. So going back to setting one up, is you have to think about your direct costs. So the charity shouldn't be bearing the costs of the subsidiary. It should be in the subsidiary itself. Now, there will be some overheads that you'll share, like your finance function, etc. And for a true and fair view in your accounts, it's expected there'll be some reasonable apportionment of those overheads as well. The other thing to think about when you're setting up a subsidiary is not just the cost of running another company. You'll need to provide consolidated accounts as well, and obviously separate filings and corporation tax returns. So there's a fair bit of expense you still need to think about when you set up a trading subsidiary. So it may not be for you or at this present time, as I said. The other thing is VAT, and that gives me a good opportunity to stop talking and stop hearing me and pass over to my VAT partner, Socrates, who will talk briefly about some of the VAT considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. I'll briefly touch on some of the VAT issues here very quickly, because I'm conscious that we're slightly over time. From a VAT perspective, one of the things that you always need to consider is the VAT liability of the income you might be receiving. From the point of view of land and property transactions, the grant of an interest in land is ordinarily exempt. And whilst that may sound like good news in that you don't have to charge VAT, on the downside, basic principle of VAT is if you're making an exempt supply, you can't reclaim VAT on associated costs. There is a provision there that allows you to convert an exempt supply into a taxable one, and that's by exercising something called your option to tax on that particular property or land. So that's one consideration you need to think about if you're going to enter into a relationship with your trading subsidiary. Luke touched on the difference from a direct tax perspective about whether you have rental income or standard rated income by virtue of use of facilities. This is very much an issue from a VAT perspective as well. Trying to determine whether actually you have a license to occupy or whether you're granting someone the use of facilities is one of the areas revenue are currently looking at and they're looking at updating their published guidance. Normally, a license to occupy involves a passive supply of land without any additional facilities. If you are adding facilities, then that makes it standard rated. So if I was to give you an example, in the past, if an organisation owned a theatre and it granted the use of that theatre to a third party, ordinarily that would have been seen as a grant of an interest in land and would be exempt. Revenue are moving towards that being the grant of the use of theatre facilities and therefore automatically standard rated regardless of whether an option to tax has been exercised. So that's something to consider and keep an eye on as we go forward. With a trading subsidiary, it may not have its own staff, so therefore there may have to be a supply of staff from the charity to the trading subsidiary. Because it's a separate legal entity, again from a VAT perspective, that will be deemed to be a taxable supply of staff. So you need to think about whether you're creating a VAT cost in your subsidiary by supplying it with staff. There are ways of trying to mitigate that. You could consider joint contracts of employment, but that doesn't always work from an employment law issue. And one of the more common ways of getting around these kind of situations where you have a charity charging its subsidiary for services, or indeed vice versa, is to consider forming a VAT group registration. And broadly what that means is that you have a single VAT registration covering both entities. You effectively have a legal fiction whereby you have a single entity from a VAT perspective. By forming a VAT group, that would mean that any suppliers of goods or services between the two organisations can be effectively ignored from a VAT perspective. Okay, that's all I briefly wanted to touch on from the VAT point of view. I'll pass you over to Catherine now, who will look at some of the legal issues involved.
Great, thank you, Luke and Socrates. So just to kind of, from a legal and the property side, is just to flag that a trading subsidiary, even though it's a charities trading subsidiary, is not a charity and is a separate entity. So if that trading subsidiary is going to be using any of the charity's land, so that might be using a room in an office or using some of the charity's land, then that has to be appropriately documented because it's a different entity using that space. So as Luke mentioned, you'd normally put in place a license to occupy, that may be a lease, but there are some key things that you need to remember. First of all, that it has to be an arm's length transaction because the charity is dealing with a non-charity. So you need to charge a market rent or a commercial license fee. Also, if the trading subsidiary is doing something different to what the charity would normally do, then you need to have a think about whether that has any planning implications. So you might need consent for change of use, or whether that impacts on any covenants over the property. And equally, if the charity lets the land, whether entering into arrangements with the trading subsidiary could breach the terms of that lease, and whether you need consent from your landlord. And then just finally, obviously, because a trading subsidiary is not a charity, it doesn't automatically get the same reliefs and exemptions that a charity would have. And in the property context, the biggest problem relating to that is business rates. So a trading subsidiary will not automatically get the same reliefs. So as we've seen, a trading subsidiary can be a really useful vehicle for carrying out different activities, but hopefully we've given you an idea of the different things you need to think about. So I'm now going to pass you back to Tim, who's going to open up some question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had a few questions come in, and I think that the first question it would be helpful to have a view on is if, and I think this is one really for Catherine, if we have a property that is standing vacant, is there any reason why we couldn't make it available to another charity for them to use, perhaps with them taking on responsibility for care of the property and an insurance cover? Is there anything else we'd need to think about?
No, I mean, the general position would be that you would charge a market value for the use of that land, take into account any obligations that the tenant was going to take on. But if it is a charity that falls within your charitable objects, so the tenant's charity falls within the landlord's charitable objects, then there is provision in the Charities Act to allow for that letting to be on less than best terms. So that might mean that you could charge a lesser rent. So yeah, absolutely, that's something you can look at.
Thank you. And a sort of follow-on question from that for Amanda, really. Many of the people listening here may have already rented properties to other charities, for example, independent schools that they've worked with in the past and so on. If they're now being approached by those tenants because those tenants are finding they are in financial difficulties, but they're also, of course, charities, what should the trustees be doing? Should they be thinking more about their own financial position or the financial position of the charity that's approached them?
Thanks, Tim. I think the main responsibility for the tenant, for the charity that owns the property, is to think about themselves. So they have an obligation, as Catherine mentioned earlier, to act in the best interests of their charity. So they need to think about what is right for them. It may well be that what is right for them is also right for their tenants, but it may not be the case. So I think it's a matter of thinking about what who the tenants are. As Catherine has just said, if those tenants are such that their charitable objects are consistent with the landlord's, then it would be absolutely right to think about whether there is an opportunity to apply your charitable purposes and provide that tenant with a reduction in rent. But if it is a commercial tenant, or if it's a charity that's objects are outside of the scope of the landlord's objects, then you always have to think in terms of your own interests. That's not straightforward, and it shouldn't just be a question of what's best for us financially, because again, as was hinted at earlier, if you basically do not provide a rent reduction and you end up with the tenant vacating the property because they cannot afford to pay the rent, then you could end up with a bigger problem. So I think it's something that you need to consider all aspects of, in line with your own objects. But the primary thing is to think what is in the best interest of our charity, but from all different perspectives.
Thank you. And a question that I think also for you, Amanda, but also for Paul probably to comment on. If people are holding surplus property at the moment, should they be thinking about renting it out, or should they be thinking about selling it? Obviously, values are going to be down potentially at the moment for selling, and there might be an advantage to rent it in the short to mid-term, but which is likely to be the better approach to take, or is there no easy answer to that? Should we go to Amanda first?
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's an easy answer, to be absolutely honest. A lot of it with property is location. So it may well be that it's still sensible to sell the property because actually the impact of COVID on the valuations in the area in which the property is located has not been significant. It may also be that you need a capital injection, you need that cash. So actually you have no alternative but to go to market. The one thing I would say, and I have a client who's in this position at the moment, they have a property which is empty that they are hoping to put to market to sell on for development. But that development obviously will be delayed because of the impact of COVID. So they are continuing to plan for that. They're putting together all the marketing activities and public paperwork and so on. But they're accepting that they're probably going to be sitting on this property for at least a year before they can send it to market. So they are looking at a temporary tenant. They're looking at a tenant that probably is consistent with their own objects, and in particular a charity tenant that's perhaps housing key workers or something. But they are continuing with the plans to take the property to market so that when the market is right, they can push the button and go immediately.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to add a comment to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd agree with exactly what sort of Amanda's mentioned, really. I mean, all clearly depends on the sort of merits, the location and type and use of the property. I think where there are sort of properties where there's a potential sort of angle for a change of use, or maybe there's an opportunity to sort of work up a planning consent for sort of redevelopment, I think in those cases, in the short term, in view of the sort of development market, I think it may be best to rent out the property or find a temporary sort of occupier whilst any sort of planning investigations are carried out. But I mean, in looking at other examples, if it were a church hall or a prime location where the markets are, you know, in our view, sort of holding up relatively well, it may be in the case to take advice from a surveyor and look at it sort of individually and then make the decision to sell. But yeah, I think it very much depends on the type of property and where it is, as Amanda mentioned. But yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one very last brief question, which I think is really another one for Paul and perhaps Catherine to comment on. Obviously, we've heard an awful lot about what charities should do if their tenants are in difficulty. Obviously, some of our charity clients rent properties themselves, and whilst they may be in a position to pay the rent, do you think they should be seeking any kind of strategic advantage by going and asking their landlords for a rent holiday in the same way that commercial tenants might be? I don't know, Paul, do you have a view on that?
I do, yes. No, thank you, Tim. I think it's a particularly sort of poignant question. I mean, we're finding, I think our advice to charities at the moment would be certainly to open dialogue with landlords, talk it through. I think where there's an opportunity, instead of paying sort of rent quarterly in advance, whether or not a request be made to pay sort of monthly in advance to sort of help sort of balance cash flow. And also, I think the preferred option, it depends on the sort of property type, but would be to seek just a deferment of rent. So just deferring, just giving a bit of breathing space in the short term, so that there's not a sort of any sort of catch-up period, so that, you know, you can agree terms that by the end of the year end, that, you know, the full year's rent would be paid. So it'd just be a slight deferment. I think that would be our sort of our first course, but Catherine no doubt will suggest other options.
Yeah, so I think that's totally fine. I think, yes, you can be asking for a rent reduction or a rent holiday or rent deferral. I think I would just bear in mind, though, if you are making those approaches to the landlord, that you have some evidence to back it up, so you can show that you've had a reduction in income, or that long-term strategy for using the property might come into question if they put too much pressure on you now. But yeah, absolutely, I think that's something you can be raising with your landlord. Perfect,
thank you. I know we just have one last question in, which I'll just briefly ask Catherine if she has a view on. If a client has a large property themselves and they have grounds that they could make available, and they're approached by neighbours asking if they could walk round the grounds, are there any issues that they might need to think about, in particular perhaps if they share the property with the school as well? Catherine.
Yeah, so I just think in that situation, you probably need to be really alive to your sort of safeguarding obligations. You also need to be a bit careful about how you document that, because obviously you don't want that to become a legal right. So if you're allowing that for a short-term period, then you probably want to have some sort of license or letter documentation in place to cover that. But yeah, also being mindful, if there is a school next door, that you know that you don't want to interrupt their business when hopefully the schools will go back.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you who watched the webinar this morning. For anyone who we haven't had the opportunity to get around to your question, we will respond to you afterwards. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.